is Daniel Serwer. I'm a scholar here at the Middle East Institute and director of the Conflict Management Program at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome you to this last public event. The end of the year is approaching here at MEI in 2017. Today's panel will discuss an important humanitarian and political issue, not only in Iraq, but also in the broader Levant, and I would say the broader Middle East, namely protecting the rights of religious minority group members. We'll have a particular focus initially on Iraqi Kurdistan, but then we'll broaden out to other issues as well. We're live streaming and recording. What this means is that I have to ask you to silence your mobile devices, but it also means, I think, that I have to ask you to use a microphone when the time for Q&A happens. The impetus for this event was a report prepared for the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, Wilting in the Kurdish Sun, the hopes and fears of religious minorities in northern Iraq. I should emphasize that this is a report that dates from before the Iraqi Kurdistan independence referendum. I know personally some of the work that went into this, some of the clever work that went into this, because my former MEI research assistant, Ian Crispin-Smith, was part of the team that worked on it. We'll hear today from another main collaborator of this report, Jomana Qaddour, the Commission's research analyst who covers Iraq. As the report deals primarily with the circumstances of people in territory governed by the KRG, it's a particular pleasure to have with us the KRG representative in Washington, Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman. Here is a panelist who has now represented the KRG with great distinction for quite a few years, I would say, now in Washington. And to help us think through the larger political reverberations from Iraq and in the region, we're pleased to have Dr. Randa Slim, who's a colleague both at MEI and at SAIS. Randa is Director for Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues here at MEI and a fellow at the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute. You have their bios in the flyers. We'll leave ample time for your questions before we conclude at 4:30. Jomana, I'd like to ask you to start us off by talking about the mandate of this report and how the Commission chose and defined the topic of the inquiry and its key findings.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Serwer, and thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you to the distinguished panelists. I'd like to start off by giving you a little bit of a background on what USCIRF is, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. We were created by Congress in 1998 by the International Religious Freedom Act. We are not part of the State Department. The State Department has a separate office that also covers very similar issues, but they cover all the countries in the world, whereas we're a much smaller shop. We have about 14 folks, and we cover the most egregious violators of religious freedom. We deliver our findings to the Secretary of State, to the White House, and Congress as well, because all three of them, both the White House and Congress, both parties are involved in appointing our commissioners. So we have a bipartisan commission. That being said, I would like to note that the reason we chose the KRG for this report is precisely because it is a haven for many of the region's minorities, especially in Iraq right now. We do not treat the KRG as a separate entity. We treat it within the Iraq chapter, but we thought, given the fact that it has a very growing population and very notable population of minorities, that it's important to treat it very much as a separate entity within that chapter. As Professor Serwer said, Crispin-Smith was one of our main team leaders in conducting this report, along with many others from the region. We had Armenians, Kurds, and others who actually participated in the collection of this data. The data was collected between May and September 2016. So that's very important because obviously the situation has changed since then. And it was published earlier this summer. We actually had intended on having this event prior to the referendum, and due to events, we delayed it, but we still think the topic is still worthy of discussion, which is why we're here today. Our team conducted over 80 interviews in the field, and that included with various government and KRG local officials, religious leaders, activists, and they were actually conducted in a variety of languages. So we had researchers who spoke Syriac, Kurdish, Arabic, English, etc., in the Nineveh Plains, Kirkuk, Dahuk, and Erbil. So we tried to be as expansive. That being said, obviously we did not, we were not able to get the pulse of everyone in the KRG, and that's impossible. Our report does highlight, and I would like to emphasize, despite any claims to the contrary, that we do believe that the KRG has been a very hospitable home to many of the region's minorities. We acknowledge that it has gone above and beyond in providing many people who have fled ISIS-held areas at the time, who were then fleeing ISIS-held areas, as well as other parts of Iraq and even Syria, came to the KRG in search of a secure home that would allow them to practice their religious freedom. And that's the key here is really religious freedom. I'm not here to talk about the administration's Iraq policy. I'm not here to talk about what happened with the referendum, but I'm here precisely just to look at very narrowly the plight of the religious freedom for the region's minorities and what their concerns are both then and where they are now for whoever is controlling those areas, be it the government of Iraq or the Kurdistan regional government. So looking at some of the changes that have happened over time, so we acknowledge fully that even during the time of the writing of this report, the KRG was dealing with incredible economic tensions with Baghdad, and that really strained the KRG's resources in terms of being able to provide, as well as fighting ISIS. So they were at the forefront of the battle against ISIS, and they helped the United States government in doing this. So these two were two major constrictions on the KRG. Now, briefly, and I'm sure Bayan can go into further detail about this issue, but obviously many of the areas that we indicated in our report are now ruled by different entities. So for example, the Nineveh Plains is now half controlled by the KRG and half controlled by various government of Iraq defense forces. And that's very important because depending on who controls those areas, they are very much responsible for the plight of the people living in those areas. Sinjar Mountain, which was held previously by the KRG, is now largely held by forces that are aligned with the Iraqi government, and so on and so forth with some of the other areas. Now, it's, as I said, that the areas that we focused on here in our report included 1.5 million Iraqi IDPs, as well as 250,000 Syrian refugees. And it has always been the most diverse part of the country, including the disputed areas that include Nineveh Plains, Sinjar, and Kirkuk. We have the Yazidi. This included many various religions, including the Christian, the Yazidi, the Shia, Sunni, Turkmen, Shabak, Kakai, Zoroastrians, Sabians, Mandeans, and the Baha'i. They all lived in this very small, constrained area. But we do, so one thing that the KRG did very well in, actually, that should be noted, is that they had a Ministry of Endowment for Religious Affairs. We had the pleasure at USCIRF of meeting with various individuals from this ministry, both here in Washington, as well as in the KRG when we were conducting this report. But there were some concerns that were highlighted that remain an issue, like I said, no matter who controls the areas where these religious minorities live. So Kurdification was an issue that various religious minorities conveyed to USCIRF. This includes Yazidis being labeled as Kurds, whether or not they chose to be labeled as Kurds. Now, there are many Yazidis who do identify as ethnic Kurds, and there are others who do not. Many Yazidis who do not identify that complain to us that they felt pressured to identify as Kurds so as to help with certain demographic numbers. And this was something that was brought to our attention in multiple different settings. We also had many, and I'll go into this a bit further, but the Christian appropriation of lands was also an issue in Kirkuk that was mentioned to us, especially by the Assyrian community. The non-Kurds who had issues going back to some of their homes, for example, after ISIS was removed from certain areas, including the Sunni minority here, told us that they felt sometimes that there was an unnecessary delay in their return when they would see other Kurdish neighbors go back to certain areas. This was highlighted both by Amnesty and the Danish Refugee Council in their various reports. Now, the Yazidis at this current time say that the blockade on Sinjar has ended since the Iraqi Defense Ministry has taken over this area. Obviously, these situations are constantly in flux. The area, especially the disputed areas, they were disputed for a reason, and things have not settled there. And we are constantly monitoring, both us and the State Department are constantly monitoring these areas because there are continuous clashes between the Iraqi Defense Forces as well as the Peshmerga forces. But from overall what we've gathered about the Yazidis is that as of right now, that Sinjar Mountain is largely under the control of the government of Iraq, which makes the government of Iraq very much responsible for the plight of the Yazidis, including the over 3,000 Yazidis that are still held captive by ISIS. Moving forward, we have some other issues. We've noted also that there have been issues and tensions between the Turkmen. Now, this is a bit complicated because some of the Turkmen also identify as Shia, and many of them have identified more with the Iraqi Defense Ministry, with the Peshmergas, and have sided with the Hashd al-Shabi. And so, therefore, their ethnic religious identity has played very much a role in who they have sided with during this time, and this has obviously made a difference and impacted the battles in Kirkuk, for example. The Christian community, as I mentioned, especially the Assyrian communities, have told us that many of their lands have been appropriated sometimes by government officials or by private parties that have used it for personal use. Now, our understanding that this is not a KRG policy, but that it has been something that at times has been left and not addressed by government officials. Actually, in my last meeting when we had the opportunity to speak with the KRG, we heard that this was starting to be addressed by the KRG, and this is important. We'd like to think that maybe our report contributed also to highlighting some of these issues that the communities have struggled with. The Sunni Arabs constitute about 20% of the Kurdistan region's population. Most of these IDPs have been displaced due to ISIS. Various Sunni communities have complained both of their treatment by the Iraqi government and the KRG in terms of being guilt by association because they are Sunni, especially Sunni Arab males have complained that they are largely seen as guilty without an opportunity to really present any evidence that they are not guilty of affiliating or associating with any ISIS members. But they have faced reprisals and they have faced discrimination, especially at checkpoints or, like I said, trying to return to their homes and lands. Overall, economic development has strained, as I mentioned in the very beginning, has strained the KRG's ability to address many of these issues that we have seen. And so a lot of the issues that are now unfolding between the government of Iraq and the KRG are going to be very much important moving forward in the future as to how these communities will be treated. You have, like I said, the Nineveh Plains, which is of importance especially to this administration because it houses many of Iraq's Christian, it houses actually the majority of Iraq's Christian population. And that area is divided in half between the KRG and the government of Iraq. It's especially crucial. Many of these Christian communities tell us they want to be treated as one unit. They want to be under one banner. They want to have leaders that represent their community at large, and they feel strength in numbers. Now, it's helped that a lot of them have also utilized their militias that are Christian, are Yazidi, etc. And this is on both sides of the aisle. Some of them have sided with Peshmerga units, some of them have sided with Iraqi Defense Forces. But the bottom line, and of most concern to us at the Commission, is that however this plays out, we do not have an opinion on the referendum, we do not have an opinion on Kurdish independence or how the government of Iraq and Kurdistan ultimately resolve this issue, but of most importance to us is ensuring the safety of these communities and their survival in the future, because they are vulnerable. They were vulnerable for the past 3 years to attacks by ISIS, and they are especially vulnerable now in a state of influx and insecurity. I'll stop there, and I'm sure I'll have an opportunity to address questions.
Thank you, Jomana. Bayan.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Middle East Institute for hosting this and for inviting me to participate. And I'd also like to thank USCIRF for the excellent work that they do. And I appreciate the report that they did on Kurdistan region, although I would disagree with the title of their report. Rather than Wilting in the Kurdish Sun, I think protected under the Kurdish Sun might be more appropriate. And I'd like to thank Jomana for highlighting that Kurdistan has been a haven for minorities, that we have provided hospitality, if that's the right word, to the thousands, hundreds of thousands of Yazidis, Christians, and others who have fled the violence in Iraq actually since 2003, and of course since 2014. I'd like to start by just talking a little bit about what the KRG has been doing for a very long time to protect religious minorities. And a lot of what I say actually also applies to ethnic minorities as well. We have, as Jomana mentioned, a Ministry for Endowment and Religious Affairs. This ministry has directorates for Yazidis, Jews, Christians, and others. We have constructed new places of worship. The ministry is also responsible for the maintenance of shrines and places of worship. Our Ministry of Education has a directorate for Turkmen studies and Assyrian studies, so the different languages. There are 21 schools that teach in Turkmen and 56 schools that teach in the Assyrian language. There are also schools that teach in Armenian. Our Ministry of Culture also has a directorate for Assyrian affairs. I'm sorry, I'm very croaky. I actually have bronchitis, so I'm sorry about my voice. And if I get into a coughing fit, somebody else please step in and talk. Kurdistan Parliament has 111 seats. 11 of those seats have been allocated to the minorities. We passed a law in 2015 on the protection of national, ethnic, and religious minorities. The Kurdistan draft constitution contains many articles that protect the rights of minorities. And actually, during the referendum period, we established a high council for the referendum, and this represented the main political parties in Kurdistan, about 15, 16, if I remember correctly. And this high council issued what they called the political manifesto to guarantee the ethnic and religious communities in Kurdistan, the idea being, what would a future independent Kurdistan offer the minorities? And this was a 16-point manifesto, and it's available on the internet, or we can email it to you if you like. It recognized the diversity of Kurdistan and guaranteed equal citizenship for everyone. It promoted self-rule, autonomy, decentralization, for different groups, using the census of 1957 as the basis for this. Now, in 1957, there were many, many more Christians in Iraq than there are now. So I think it's pretty significant that we went back to that census, and it's also probably the most reliable census in Iraq. The manifesto also guaranteed by law fair representation of minorities in elected councils, institutions, in the diplomatic field, and so on, also in the Supreme Court. There were linguistic rights, religious festivals would become national holidays, there would be a reversal of demographic change and justice for genocide. As I said, there are 16 points, but what I'm trying to convey to you is the significance of the rights of the minorities, ethnic and religious minorities in Kurdistan. Our leadership takes this very seriously. We believe in Kurdistan and Iraq, but we focus on Kurdistan as a place of diversity, and we're proud of our diversity. We are proud of the Assyrians as the indigenous people of the region and of Iraq. We are proud of the Chaldeans, the Syriacs. We are proud of the Turkmen, Yazidis, the Kurds, and Arabs. And we don't want any of them to leave. Of course, there has been a mass migration out of the country because of ISIS. But we believe that Kurdistan and Iraq are stronger with all of these components staying in place. I'd like to address some of the points that Jomana highlighted from the USCIRF report. The concerns about the Kurdification, and the example given was that some Yazidis do not want to be identified as Kurds, whereas others do. I think this highlights one of the dilemmas that we have, which is that the Yazidi community is fragmented. The Christian community is fragmented. In fact, all of us in Iraq, whether you're Shia, Sunni, Kurd, Yazidi, Christian, Shabak, Kaki, we are all fragmented. And the fact that there are all these different militias and different groups is a reflection of that. I'm from Sinjar. I'm not a Yazidi, but my family is originally from Sinjar. And I have many Yazidi friends just through where I was originally from. And I've had many discussions with them, and I say to them, I don't know what to say to you because you tell me you're a Kurd and you tell me that you're not. How should we, as a government, deal with that? And I would say similar fragmentation within the Christian community. When you talk to some of the Assyrians, particularly those abroad, and particularly those who may not have been to Kurdistan and Iraq, you would imagine that Kurdistan is a concentration camp if you're a Christian. Whereas if you talk to a Chaldean, who are the majority in Kurdistan among the Christians, they will give you a different story. Yesterday, I had the pleasure of seeing Archbishop Warda, the Archbishop of Erbil, just before he went to the White House to see Vice President Pence. And we had a talk about his visit to New York, to the UN, his meetings in Washington. And I asked him, what is the situation in Kurdistan? And he said, first and foremost, we are grateful to the KRG. And I brought this book just in case I needed to refer to it, but I would also recommend this book to you, where there is a chapter written by Bishop Warda, there's another chapter written by a member of the Free Yazidi Foundation. And they are critical of the KRG, but they also recognize the religious freedom that they have in the Kurdistan region and the protections that we offer. And we see them as equal citizens. We don't see that we're doing them a favor or they're doing us a favor. We are equals here. Can the KRG improve? Absolutely. I think every government can always improve. And I think one thing to bear in mind is that society's demands change as time evolves. If you look at, some of the discussions you have here in the United States, today the Supreme Court is deciding on whether a baker has to bake a cake for a gay couple. Was that an issue in the United States 20 years ago? I don't think so. It's an issue today because your society has moved on and there are new topics, and it's the same in Kurdistan. We have new issues to deal with every single day. The demands of society change, and we as the Kurdistan regional government have a duty to respond to that and try to work in lockstep with all of the communities that make up Kurdistan region in how we progress our entire society and continue to have peaceful coexistence. One of the points that I'd finally like to address before I stop is Jomana's point about the Sunni Arab community complaining about guilt by association. There are about 1 million displaced Arabs who are sheltered in the Kurdistan region, and many of them are Sunni. I would say the majority are Sunni Arabs, but there are others as well. It is difficult, it's true, if you are a Sunni Arab and you have fled Mosul or somewhere else. And yes, the population will be suspicious of you. I think that's unfortunate, but it's also natural. And if you especially think about the families that fled Mosul as the city was being liberated. They are under great suspicion. Are they members of ISIS? Are they ISIS members who've shaved off their beards and are now wearing different clothes and saying different things? Or are they just victims? And all that we can do is watch very carefully, because we have to protect them against reprisals, and we have to protect our population and the minorities who fled the ISIS genocide. We have to be mindful of all of the tensions that are put on us as a government, protecting the minorities, sheltering whoever came, whoever knocked on our door. We have opened our doors to them and we are sheltering them. But we also have a duty to protect our people and to protect the others who have sought shelter with us. Final point. I think the United States and the international community has a responsibility to help the Kurdistan region. We are still housing 1.8 million displaced Iraqis and Syrian refugees. Iraq has imposed a flight ban, international flight ban on Kurdistan. Thousands of aid workers cannot get in and out. Hashd al-Sha'bi has committed atrocities against Kurdish people in Kirkuk and Tozkhormatu. This has been documented by Amnesty International. I don't hear the international outcry about that. We need you to take all of these human rights abuses seriously, whether they are against Kurds, Christians, Yazidis, Arabs, or anybody else. Thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Bayan. Randa.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Dan, for sharing this panel, and I thank very much my colleagues on this panel for their insightful remarks. What I would like to first start by commending and building on what Bayan has said, which is the task that the KRG has taken upon itself to host 1.8 million Iraqis and Syrian refugees. I mean, this is not an easy task to have done, to do and to have done, given the economic difficulties and the security conditions that the KRG and Iraq in general was facing. And so they deserve our thanks, and they deserve praise for having done so and for continuing to do so. Like other countries in the region, like, for example, Lebanon, which has taken one of the highest per capita number of Syrian refugees. So having, and especially at a time when our country of 300+ million is closing its door to citizens from 6 countries. So let's thank them for the work that they have done and they continue to do. Having said that, I think the problems that are being raised by the report are problems that are real, important, need to be addressed, and there are problems that are not only specific to the KRG, but also to the region writ large. And that's the relationship between the different components of a diverse and pluralistic societies. And it's not the problem in Iraq, it's also the problem in Syria, it's a problem in Lebanon, it's a problem in Egypt, it's a problem in Turkey. Now, with respect to that, I think we need to look at what the report raises at least 4 different levels of analysis in terms of causes and impact. The first one is the issue of the rule of law. I don't think it's a problem of the lack of laws or the lack of a legal framework to protect the rights of all citizens, because I believe many of us are, most of these countries are a bunch of minority groups rather than minorities and majorities. In the scheme of things, in a grand scheme of things, it's all a collection of minority groups. Anyway, so the legal framework is there. The problem has always been, and as the report highlights, is a question of application of the laws. For example, discrimination in employment, discrimination in access to education, especially high-level education. So that's a problem that needs to be addressed, and it's usually, it has so far proven intractable, partly because a lot of it is invisible. And so how can you strengthen enforcement of laws on the book that seek to protect the rights of all citizens, including minority groups? I think that's the question that needs to be addressed going forward. The second level of analysis is economic. It's always hard, based on studies, to really determine whether economic insecurities, economic difficulties like Iraq and the KRG have been facing since 2013-14 are the cause and or are the result of this kind of grievances that usually spill over into the political sphere. And often what we have seen in the region is that even sectarian mobilization is done in terms of securing access to political and economic right within the framework of a nation state where these relationships have yet to be determined. So the role of economic injustices, the role of economic discrepancies, and how that promotes the kind of discrimination that the report refers to, and how this can be addressed as part of a pathway forwards in improving relationships between different components of societies in the region. The third level is a political level, and that has to do with inclusion, political participation, and that applies to the KRG, but also it applies to Iraq in general. And that is something that has been accentuated by what has happened since 2011, when the old political compacts that have existed at the time between different groups and between different political communities and parties were really broken down. If we look, for example, at Iraq in general, there have been 4 planks to Iraq's political compact since 2015. One plank has been a national reconciliation plank, which to date has not been accomplished. A second plank is one of political inclusion. Again, that has yet to be materialized and to be accomplished. A third plank is one of fair division of the oil resources. And the fourth plank, which applies also to the KRG, is the issue of democratic federalism and what it means to Iraq going forward. I think part of the problems that we are seeing exacerbated in the KRG as a result of this mass migration of people into the KRG as a result of the ISIS violence is a problem of a political level, of what federalism means, how it applies, and then how it needs to be applied going forward. The fourth issue I would like to raise, and that has to do with a framing, the narrative. And that applies not only to the KRG, but also, as I said, to the rest of the region, and also our responsibility in the US in contributing to this framing. And that has to do with this framing of minority versus majority, minority rights. Granted, minority groups in the region, especially Christian groups, but also Yazidis and others, face intense amounts of threats to the point that even it's threatening the nature and the character of the Levant, of this part of the world. I mean, we are today seeing or witnessing the possibility of whole groups being totally disappeared, basically, from a historical role that they have always had. Some of the most ancient, world's ancient Christian communities exist in northern Iraq. With the rate of immigration that's happening, I mean, these communities might not exist in 20 years from now. Having said that, I think the way to go forward is not to talk about minorities versus majorities, but the way to reframe this debate, and we have a responsibility to that, is to talk about citizenship rights. It's not only the rights of Christians, it's equally the rights of Shias. It's equally the rights of Sunnis. As Bayan has well pointed out, all of these communities that make up the diversity of the region, the diversity of Iraq, are all fragmented, and they are all, and their rights are all under threat, you know, by some group or another. And with our own political consideration, which I understand, especially with this administration, this emphasis on, for example, Christian groups' rights makes sense within this political reality. But also, I think we need to emphasize about the political rights and the economic rights and the human rights of all groups. We need not, and I think that's part of the reframing that needs to happen in terms of talking about human rights in the Middle East, and especially in this country. And I think the problem of this framing that has evolved over time, but also it's a problem that is shouldered, or whose responsibility is partially shouldered by groups and by states of the region, is how the state, especially contemporary Arab state, has tried to, since the middle of the 20th century, to consolidate a national identity that is not based on a pluralistic concept of society, that is not based on accepting the diversity of the society, but that looked at diversity through the lenses of uniformity and conformity. And that's a problem that people of the region, but also governments of the region, are responsible for. And that has created, over periods of time, lately we are looking at it through a sectarian lens, but before it was through, and through an ethnic lens, and before it was through a religious lens, that created this we versus them narrative. And that created a distorted definition of what we the people means in each of these countries. And as long as these countries lack a cohesive concept of a national identity that is built on accepting diversity and that promotes and nurtures pluralism, I think this problem of discrimination that we have seen is going to continue, despite, as I said, the fact that we have the legal frameworks in place to help to fight against that. But this kind of discrimination that is pushed for political purposes by these states and official authorities and embraced by people for a number of considerations, economic, political, is something that needs to be addressed going forward. I will stop at this point.
Thank you all very much. If I may try to summarize, I'll probably make terrible mistakes here. Jomana emphasizes that recognizing the difficult circumstances in which the KRG finds itself, that there are problems with religious minorities, question of Kurdification, of unequal treatment, of property expropriation. These are rather specific problems that have existed from time immemorial, but the current circumstances don't make them easier to deal with.
Exactly.
Bayan says, look, I mean, we're doing our best. We're trying to protect minorities under the Kurdish Sun. We support them with education, with seats in parliament, with a minority manifesto, which I haven't seen, but which I trust is as good as Bayan suggests it is. And she points to two big issues. One is the fragmentation of minority communities, in which not all Shabak or Yazidis choose to be Kurds, and some do, some don't, and that creates difficulties. But in addition, you have this enormous number of displaced people and refugees in Iraqi Kurdistan. And why are they there? They're there because they're a little bit better off than they would have been elsewhere. So we have to recognize that. And Kurdistan needs help in dealing with that problem, including the very difficult problems associated with post-ISIS security issues, with the very real fears that people have that the ISIS fighters will go underground and attack their communities. Randa asks us to take a step back, say, look, it's not easy for the KRG. There are real problems there, but there are real problems throughout the region. Rule of law, which exists on paper, doesn't exist in practice. There's discrimination, there's economic injustice, there's political exclusion, and the failure of the political compact, especially in Iraq. And she urges that the way forward is towards recognition of individual citizenship rights and pluralism within an overall national identity. So I think we've had a very rich series of presentations. I did want to point out that this wonderful book on the Iraqi Kurdistan region, A Path Forward, was done at Johns Hopkins site. I can be proud of that. And is available, I believe, on the Center for Transatlantic Relations website for free. So
Oh, for free?
I think so. I think so. I won't promise it. Go look. I could be wrong. The floor is open.
Dr. Serwer, would you actually mind if I address something?
Oh,
Randa
no,
said?
I won't mind at all. I
Okay.
should have offered you guys an opportunity.
I just
Please.
wanted to highlight something that Randa said that I fully agree with, and that's the concept of citizenship or muwatani. That's something that actually when in my travels to, I was hosted by the KRG. I went to Erbil, I went to Sulaimania, and I had a chance to talk to different minority communities myself, separate and apart from this report. And I talked to many of these communities, and especially the Christian leaders, about the concept of citizenship. Because as someone who is originally from the region, as someone originally from Syria and has worked on Syria for many years now, I have seen the same fragmentation, like Randa said, throughout the region. And putting people, today they're in charge of this area, so giving them more rights, and then tomorrow them being eclipsed by another group does lead to sort of a vicious cycle of us versus them, and we're seeing that throughout the region, like Randa said. And unfortunately, when I've spoken to some of the Christian leaders about this, they said, but we need special treatment until we can feel secure and safe enough.
That's fair.
And it's something that, it's hard to hear that, they continue to feel unsafe no matter where they are. It's not necessarily a direct threat, but a lot of these communities, as both Bayan and Randa highlighted, that they fear extinction, and they fear that their numbers have dwindled from, millions to maybe less than 100,000 in some cases. And so many of them have said, no, we want special treatment until we tell you we feel safe enough to where we're not going to be discriminated, on the national identity cards, or when we apply for employment, or, for example, when they're selling some things. I know there were some Yazidi traders who told us that there are some, more extremist Sunni Muslims who may say, no, we don't buy from them because they are not the people of the book, etc. So these are things that any society, I think right now in the Middle East, is really struggling with, because I think citizenship is the goal, but getting there is a very difficult part that we all have to think about.
Please.
Then I'm going to answer as well.
Go ahead.
Please,
Go
no,
ahead.
no,
That's all right.
Okay. I'm actually going to agree with Randa and Jomana that citizenship is exactly right, and the political manifesto that I talked about is real, and I'm happy if anybody wants a copy of it. If you contact our office, we will send you the link. But I think that manifesto sets out how the religious and ethnic minorities in the Kurdistan region would be represented politically in the institutions, in the Peshmerga force or our military, in the diplomatic field, a revision of the higher education system. And my other point about citizenship actually is about education. To go to your point, Randa, about the thinking across the Middle East, which is uniformity and them and us, one of the diseases that I think we have across the Middle East is education.
Yes.
Young children, or people from a young age, are told there is only one religion, and that is Islam. Well, if you live in Kurdistan and your neighbor is Yazidi and across the road is a Christian and down the road is a Shabak, what does that make you think as a child about your neighbors and your school friends? So certainly in Kurdistan region, the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Endowment and Religious Affairs are looking at revising the curriculum so that instead of Islamic studies from primary school or elementary school age, children would be taught religious studies, so they would learn about other religions. But I think, Kurdistan can take these steps, but we're part of the Middle East. We're not even a sovereign state. We are automatically impacted by whatever happens around us. One very last point. Erbil, the province or governorate of Erbil, had a Christian governor, and I believe, I may be wrong, but I believe he was the first Christian governor of a Muslim province. And unfortunately, he was assassinated by Islamist extremists, and I believe this was in 2001. But back in 2001, we had a Christian as the leading figure of one of our main provinces in Kurdistan region. Anyway.
Randa.
Just one point, and I think, and that has to do with the way forward. I think I agree again with both Jomana and Bayan. And I think one way by which we need to think of preserving and protecting these groups, I think pushing this whole idea of decentralization. And because at the local level, these communities, which have their own unique configuration of different subgroups, I think at the local level, there are more opportunities for people to have more of a role in education curricula, for example, in education curricula at the local level that can protect their culture, that can protect their languages, that at the local level, at this council level, you have more opportunities for more political participation by minority groups that make a large percentage of these communities. So I think when we look at the way forward, decentralization should figure out as one way by which the interests of minority groups or minority communities could be advanced in a more representative fashion, but also we can create more platforms for increased political participation and increased political inclusion.
Thank you very much. May I open the floor? No.
Sorry.
The floor is open. Questions, quick comments, please.
Hi.
Please stand up, introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ashley. I'm a graduate student at American University. And my question is for Bayan. I was just wondering if there are any discussions or efforts being made to give back the land that Assyrians say have been taken from them.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Are there any discussions or efforts being made to give back the land that Assyrians say have been taken from them?
So you're going to do
okay.
it question by question, or?
Well, let's start that
Yeah.
way. We'll see. We may have to pile on a few at a time.
Thank you for the question. Land disputes are a problem across Iraq, and it's not a problem just between Assyrians and Kurds or Christians and Muslims. It's a problem between Kurds and Kurds, Muslims and Muslims, and all other groups. It's part of the legacy of Iraq, where there has been war and displacement throughout Iraq's history. Right now, you have potentially nearly 200,000 people that just in the past 2 months have been displaced from Kirkuk and Tos Hormatu. They're Kurds, and Arabs have moved into their homes. I'm from Sinjar. My family in the 70s were thrown out of our homes, and Arabs were moved there. So property disputes are not a religious issue per se. They exist across Iraq. Should it be dealt with? Absolutely. I think we need a commission, and I believe there was or is a commission in Kurdistan to deal with this, but it needs funding. I know that Fish Khabur was a very good example of land disputes that were settled. These were disputes going back a very long time. But it's a very complicated issue, it's wide-ranging, and it's very deep. It's not, unfortunately, something that has a quick answer to it.
Please.
Thank you. My name is Jomana Abdul Rahman, research fellow at the Endowment for Middle East Truth. My question is for you. You used the word Kurdification. I would be a little bit hesitant. I have a comment before. I would be a little bit hesitant of using that word because if we look back at Kurdish history, we've been Arabized, we've been Turkified, and ethnic cleansing and religious cleansing has occurred against the Kurds from Iran as well. So we are very quick to use that word Kurdification because and you have to acknowledge that Kurdistan is not a state. We don't have that space to govern, as does Iraq does. But my question is, I appreciate this report a lot. This is very good work. But this is something, this is looking back at what's happened. Mm-hmm. We also have to look at what's happening today. In Kirkuk, especially. I'm from Kirkuk myself. Kirkuk is being Arabized. We should acknowledge that. We should use that term, Arabification, by Shiite Arabs, by Shiite Iran, and by the central government of Iraq. What are we going to do to prevent the Arabification of Kirkuk? Thank you.
No, thank you for your comment. And if you have a chance to read the longer version of the report, we do actually refer to the Arabization of many of the areas by Saddam Hussein. So that's something that the researchers fully acknowledge in the report. And then we follow this discussion by saying that in some ways this is also a reaction because some of those areas were forcibly Arabized and now they're sort of returning back to their original state, which were in many cases originally Kurdish majority. So I don't dispute that statement. In terms of what happened, I'm fully aware of what Iran did. I'm not going to defend the Iranian-backed militias. You won't find me doing that. The one thing I think that is unfortunate about this report is that it was done before the current events. I think it would be great to have a follow-up report, probably not now, but maybe in another 3 months or 6 months, sort of analyzing what happened during this time period, because I fully acknowledge that the current report right now did not anticipate what we now see happening in the KRG and the unfortunate events that have transpired. In terms of Kirkuk, I have heard exactly what you have said. We didn't put that in the report because obviously this is something that is happening right now. Kirkuk is a very diverse area. It has Turkmen, it has Arabs, Kurds, Sunni, Shia, and so it is an area that is anyway very diverse. But it's, from what I understand, and I'm sure Randa can elaborate, that there are many more Arabs that are going back now, being sort of pushed back there by the government of Iraq to take that area back, sort of, to say that it is not a Kurdish area, because obviously this is a disputed area. It has been disputed. So yes, I don't disagree with anything that you said, but thank you for highlighting those. I don't know if anyone wants to add. Randa, if you wanted to add anything to.
I mean, I think what Ayatollah Sistani has said early in the crisis, post the referendum, in terms of having to go back to dialogue and having to have the dialogue on the basis of the Kurds' constitutional rights, and including implementation of all the provisions that are in the Constitution, including Article 140, which deals with this whole issue of disputed territories, I think is the way to go. And we have seen Arabization, we have seen Kurdification, we are now seeing re-Arabization. I think this cycle needs to be broken. And the way it's going to be broken is, again, and I totally believe in that, is to go back to the Iraqi constitution, which all components of Iraq, political and societal component, worked on. There was a referendum, it was passed, and to go back to the implementation of this constitution that preserves the rights of all citizens. I think this is, the problem is that we are now entering an electoral season that's going to be until May. You're going to find reluctance on the part of Baghdad, especially of the Prime Minister, to make any serious concessions that can be used by his political opponents as not standing tall and being tough enough vis-à-vis the Kurds. Between now and then, there needs to be dialogue, but we cannot expect a dialogue to be held on the relationship in general, but it could be dialogue on specific technical issues that can start laying the groundwork for some confidence building between the KRG and between Baghdad. Opening the airports, for example, now that all the conditions that have been put forward by Baghdad vis-à-vis the airports have been fulfilled by the KRG. Some cooperation on counterterrorism, which we know in the lead up to the Battle of Mosul, there was excellent cooperation between the Peshmerga and the ISF, and the ISIS threat is not finished. They might have been driven out of territory, but the ISIS fighters have melted away in the deserts, and they are still there, and they are looking for opportunities to regroup. So continued cooperation between the Peshmerga and the ISF on the fighting a possible, preventing a possible re-emergence of ISIS. And then also there can be some kind of economic cooperation going forward. And past the election, depending on what happens in the election, hoping that maybe Mr. Al-Abadi will win a large mandate, because I think he is the best Iraqi politician to be able to move this dialogue forward in a courageous way, assuming he has a sizable enough electoral mandate as a result of the upcoming elections.
Others? Please.
Hi, thank you everyone for sharing those insights with us. My name is Ammar, I work for Word Learning. I have a twofold question. First, how safe is it in terms of movement in between Erbil and to Baghdad, between Kurdish and Arabs? And also, because I work a lot with youth from all over Iraq, what's youth role in contributing to a peaceful transformation of this conflict?
Bayan, do you want to address that?
Your question about how safe is it, do you mean to travel, to go from Erbil or Kurdistan to Baghdad? Well, there's a ban on international flights, but there are domestic flights, so you can fly from Soleimani and Erbil to Baghdad. I don't know how many people are doing that. I don't know how safe Kurds feel in Baghdad right now. Don't forget there has been violence. There's been looting, demolition of houses. 2,000 houses in Toshormatu were destroyed. There are reports of rapes by the PMUs or PMF in Kirkuk and Toshormatu. So I'm not really sure as a Kurdish citizen if you would feel particularly safe to go to other parts of Iraq. In theory, the way is open. In practice, I don't know. Your other question about engagement of youth, I think that's a really important question. Kurdistan, like the rest of Iraq, like most of the Middle East, has a very young population. And the young population has better smartphones than I do. They are much more in tune with what's happening around the world than my generation when we were growing up. And so they want the same things that young people have elsewhere, whether it is a smartphone or a say, or the right to a better education and the right to a job at the end of that education. We have all of those same pressures on us in Kurdistan region. We have been trying to reform our economy. Our economy is very heavily geared towards the public sector, to the government sector. So the government is the biggest employer. Most university students want a job in the government. We're a bit like India. You know, everybody wants a cushy job with the government because they think they'll get a good pension at the end of it and so on. And we have been trying to reform our economy. We have a package of reforms that we've drawn up with the World Bank, and the World Bank has been helping us to implement them. I don't know now because of the flight ban if that's ongoing, but it was until then. And what ultimately we want to do in the long term for the Kurdistan region's economy is to diversify ourselves away from oil, to strengthen sectors like tourism, manufacturing, agriculture. Tourism employs an awful lot of people at all levels, whether it's the big hotel chains to the little mom and pop shop that sells ice cream to tourists at a particular resort. So they're job-creating industries that we're looking at. And we also want to make the private sector much, much more dynamic so that a young person is more attracted to working for the private sector. And the public sector is somewhere way down the list. Right now, a job in the government, even though salaries have been reduced, they're paid in arrears, people still want to work in the government, and we need to change that dynamic. So these are long-term plans. We've already embarked on those reforms. Right now, everything's in a flux, but that's our vision.
Randa?
I'd like to add a little bit on that. Not necessarily just looking at the youth, but society in general. Now you have a lot of these aggrieved groups, and it's going to be very hard to tell them, we just need you to move forward and forget the past. And this is something that we have recommended both in this report and in our annual report that's released usually in May, is really the idea of putting genuine effort in reconciliation between a lot of these communities and giving them a chance to sometimes to have accountability for actions that community members have committed and some of the crimes that they've committed. And like I said, I know this isn't targeted towards the youth, but I think in order to facilitate a better future for the youth, you cannot overlook, I think, this important critical step. And on that note, I wanted to also mention that this September, the UN Security Council passed in a very important resolution, 2379, which finally established the selection of a special advisor and an independent investigative team to support domestic efforts, so within the government of Iraq, to hold ISIS accountable for its actions. And I think this is something that by the way, was incredibly hard to get approved. The Iraqi government was very hesitant, actually, to approve this because they were afraid that it would open the floodgates for, looking at its own crimes. But I think this is something, especially relevant to the religious communities, like I said, especially the ones that fled ISIS, that this Security Council resolution gives them some hope that there might be some formal mechanisms, because right now the mechanisms available are very informal. They're trying to hold some, informal ways of accountability for people who are accused of being ISIS fighters, and in some cases they're being shot or killed due to conditions, very terrible prison conditions that they're being held in. So I think really also making sure that we don't overlook this step, I think will be important to creating, I think, an overall better environment for all of Iraq's inhabitants, including the religious minority communities. So.
I just can, I mean, what needs to happen going forward is and that could be part of the dialogue that hopefully in the future will be launched between Erbil and Baghdad. But also it requires some preparatory work for Baghdad to do on its own, which is still lacking, which is what is Baghdad's vision for reconciliation, reintegration, and reconstruction post-ISIS. I think this is the kind of work that Baghdad need to take a leadership role in developing. And right now, I don't see this taking place, but this is something that, because where we are today is very much back to the future. I mean, many of the issues that need to be addressed are issues that were, that have plagued Iraq since 2004, 2005. And they are always delayed for one reason or another. The last one being ISIS. But these are issues that are not, unless they are not addressed, and addressed in a, let's say, institutionalized and sustained manner, it's going to be hard to break the cycle of violence. And these are the old issues of national reconciliation, the issue of political inclusion, the issues of rights and responsibilities, and the issues of, you know, the relationship between the state, society, between the center and the provinces. And these are basic issues about what is Iraq's political compact and its future going forward.
No other questions?
Oh, they were hiding.
You've been hiding.
Thank you very much. My name is Arash.
Stand up, tell us where you're from.
My name is Arash. I'm with the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan. The first question is for Ms. Qaddour. So basically, the gentleman asked the question about Kirkuk. My question is, how do you determine to react to these atrocities? Because when Daesh was doing these atrocities, actually we could see the real-time reaction to these violations. But right now, the Iraqi forces are doing the same thing in Kirkuk, in Tus Hormatu, and in Khanaqin, and based on actually different media outlets. But everyone's silent. This is a question for me. And actually, the other question is, you seem to all agree on citizenship, but let me disagree on that, because we are experiencing these debates right now in Iran. Well, citizens are not empty containers. They have culture, they have identity, and they have different conflicting identities. So when you are defining citizen and who is citizen of the country, even the language that is actually, the laws are written by, they're affecting this definition. So I just wanted to have a quick comment on that. Thank you very much.
Jomana?
Yes, so although we are a government body, we're created by Congress, we don't, I mean, I don't advise the US government on how to address the military situation in Kirkuk. That's way beyond my mandate, unfortunately. So I understand your frustration that in 2014, when the United States saw ISIS on Sinjar, and we established a coalition to stop, to begin the war on ISIS. I do agree that right now it's much more silent, and we are not seeing a response from any government on what to do. The one thing I can tell you is that as a commission, we try to emphasize in our meetings with Congress members, et cetera, that we do want the halting, to halt the fighting between the parties, and to urge them to, come to a more peaceful resolution of their differences. I cannot, it's beyond my mandate, frankly, to have an opinion on the ultimate outcome of Kirkuk, but we urge the protection of all peoples in those areas, especially vulnerable communities, like we said, including the religious minority communities. In terms of citizenship, it's an important, I think what you said makes a lot of sense. We try to highlight any areas, for example, in our reports on the Constitution where it may distinguish one group over another. For example, any elements of the Constitution that may refer to the Sharia, which would obviously exclude people who do not, believe in the Sharia or are not Muslim, or that anything that may say, in various constitutions, like I said, we look at various countries where the president has to be of one faith or another. So that everyone feels that this constitution is a reflection of them. These are issues we try to highlight in our report, and all we can do is advise, and highlight, like I said, articles that may be problematic for communities that cannot participate in that particular definition of what it means to be a citizen. That's what I would say.
Bayan, would you like to comment on what's happening in Kirkuk at all?
Sure. So what's happened is that since October 16, Kirkuk, Tozhormatu, and other areas have been taken over both by the Iraqi security forces, but also, crucially, by the Iran-backed militias. We have raised concerns about the militias or the popular mobilization forces from the day that they were created. The Iraqi constitution stipulates that there should be no militias. So when they were created, the Iraqi parliament had to legitimize them. Some people said this was a good thing because it meant that they could be held to account. Well, nobody is ever held to account in Iraq, so I can't see that happening, especially with an armed group or groups. What we're seeing in Kirkuk is that since October 16th, about 180,000 people have fled. So overnight, Kirkuk, which was actually relatively stable under Governor Najmuddin Karim, has become unstable. Arab families are being moved in. Houses are either in Tozhormatu either have been demolished or been occupied. And so these human rights violations have been documented by Amnesty International. Rudao, one of the TV channels, sent a reporter who did a documentary on the destruction there. The international reaction has been very muted, and in fact, just today, Prime Minister Nechirvan Barzani, in his weekly press conference, addressed this and said that there seems to be an effort in the international community to minimize what's happening. But it's very, very serious. If we're talking about reconciliation, if we're talking about progressing in Iraq, then we need to stop this. And it's happening under the international community's watch, and particularly the United States, which is our partner, our ally. We have no better partner than the United States, and yet we're not really seeing a serious response to what's been happening over there. And with regards to the international flight ban, this is not only killing off business in Kurdistan, it's collective punishment of the people of Kurdistan. It also means that a lot of aid workers, including workers who are there to help Christian families return to their homes in the Nineveh Plain, they are not able to fly into Kurdistan to do their work. Baghdad needs to understand, as Randa said, that at the end of the day, all of this has to be resolved through dialogue. We have opened the way for dialogue for weeks and months. It's now up to Baghdad to take the step that we've taken and start that dialogue. If I may, just one thing about the Constitution, which you referred to. The Constitution of Iraq is actually a pretty good document. It has faults like all constitutions. It can be interpreted this way and that. But for example, Article 140, which deals with the disputed territories, has never been implemented. If it had been implemented by the end of 2007, 10 years ago, maybe we wouldn't be where we are today. Maybe the people of the Nineveh plain, the Christians, would feel more secure where they are because they would have had a voice in a referendum on their future. Maybe the people of Kirkuk would know where they stand if Article 140 had been implemented. We can still implement it. The other point, there are many, many points to make about the Constitution, but one other that I think is relevant to this discussion is the creation of a second chamber of Parliament. The Constitution sees two chambers, the Council of Representatives, the House of Representatives, which we have now, but there should also be a second chamber, which is a kind of a guarantor of the federal structure of Iraq. The second chamber is supposed to represent the provinces and the regions. That second chamber has never been created, so there is no guarantee for the federal structure of Iraq. There are many other issues that I could highlight with the Constitution, but ultimately I think the Constitution is where we need to look. Fortunately, Prime Minister Abadi refers to the Constitution in almost every speech he makes, so we hope that that's a good sign and that this is where we will all end up.
Randa, did you have?
No, I concur with whatever they said.
I think unless somebody has an anxious hand up, one more, that's it.
Famous last words.
Hi, my name's Sam. I work for a religious nonprofit in the DC area. So we've been wondering if there's any sort of international effort to partner with NGOs in the area. I understand the flight ban is, you know, a pretty good inhibitor of that. But are there domestic NGOs that are open to partnership from, you know, international with international NGOs, I guess?
Sure, there are. There are many. Fortunately or unfortunately, because of the influx of displaced people from across other parts of Iraq since actually 2003, there have been NGOs in Kurdistan that have gained a lot of experience, gained a reputation, attracted funding, that are able and do already partner with international NGOs or even carry out work with the UN and others, and I believe there's a representative of one of these NGOs right here. If there's anybody else here, please put your hand up. But certainly there are many NGOs of all stripes that can work with international organizations.
Last word, Randa?
Really? In terms of what? In terms of this question?
This question or anything else?
The last word, yes. What I want to say in terms of citizenship is, again, maybe we disagree on how we see citizenship defined. And I think Fanar Haddad, in one of his books, wrote about this process by which the contemporary Arab nation state have defined or tried to define a national identity concept, not by inclusion, but through negation of other sub-identities. So when we look at a citizen of Iraq, that does not mean a citizen of Iraq cannot have as part of his or her identity construct being a Shia or a Sunni, being a Kurd or an Arab, being a woman or a man. So in terms of, so the definition of citizenship that many of the states of the region today adopt or have adopted and in practice have been implementing are based on a definition of citizenship that negates these other identities that tend to be seen as a source of threat to what is perceived as a national identity. That's where I want to stop.
Bayan, the last word?
I actually, thank you, Randa. You reminded me of something that I wanted to say about citizenship. Within the Iraqi construct, Kurdistan doesn't have authority over citizenship. It's the authority of the federal government or Baghdad. So I'm Kurdish, I'm an Iraqi. My husband is not an Iraqi Kurd, he's an Iranian Kurd. Therefore, he's an alien in Iraq. Therefore, our children cannot have Iraqi citizenship.
Because the mother cannot pass.
Because I'm a woman, therefore I do not count everyone. And my husband doesn't count as a human being either because he's not an Iraqi. So this goes back to your discussion about citizenship. It is, of course, about different cultures, ethnicities, religious groups, but also as women, we are denied. And therefore, my children are also denied. And we, as the Kurdistan region, are hemmed in by this. We can't do anything about this. Even though the constitution of Iraq doesn't allow this, this is the practice. I have tried to register my children, and I can't do it. And that's the most ridiculous situation to be in. And that just tells you what kind of citizenship we have in our country.
Jomana, last word.
First of all, thank you for letting us really talk about this report and for all of your thoughtful comments and questions. I didn't delve into the problems with the Iraqi government itself. We really were looking at the KRG, but obviously the issue you highlighted, Bayan, is one of many that we do highlight in our annual report. So please take a look in May when we do. I remember last year the Iraqi government was trying to ban the sale and drinking of alcohol, and that was problematic for many people who are not Muslims or Muslims who don't necessarily practice. And I remember this was an issue. Thankfully, it didn't pass. But there are many laws like this that do bring up identity issues that can be offensive at minimum and outright discriminatory towards religious minorities at maximum. So it's something that we will continue to look out for at USCIRF. It's something we're committed to doing and to highlighting. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Let me, in concluding, just say that, you know, a lot of the problems we've been discussing are problems that don't get solved once and for all.
No.
They, and I think we should recognize on a day that an issue is discussed in the Supreme Court about who can buy a birthday cake, that we haven't resolved all these issues ourselves. It's not surprising to me that those who've lived in America come to the table with ideas about citizenship as a solution rather than as a problem. But let's face it, we face a lot of problems ourselves, and what we can do is to wish the Iraqis well, to be honest about our assessments of what's going on in Iraq and in Kurdistan.
And wish them our support.
And in the region, and wish them our support. And I want to thank the panel for its very honest and open discussion of the issues. Thank you.
Thank you.